Now come to the 10-minute rule motion. Mr. Andrew Dismore.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I beg to move that leave be given to bring in a bill to introduce a national day to learn about and remember the Holocaust. This year I visited Auschwitz-Birkenau for the first time on a visit sponsored by the Holocaust Education Trust.
We would like to welcome you to returning flight 836A to Katowice.
The cold-blooded, methodical processing of fellow human beings was brought home to me, not just by the huge tragic piles of personal belongings, but by the detail. The sheer scale was only revealed at Birkenau, where 1.5 million people died.
Good morning and welcome on this flight to Poland, to Auschwitz this morning. I know for a lot of you, as you got out of your beds at some ridiculously early time today, the concept of going and coming back from Poland must have seemed very strange to you. The whole concept of actually a day visit to Auschwitz may seem very bizarre. Please don't come with any preconceived idea of how you should react. For all of you, we know that today will be a very tiring day, both physically, mentally, and also emotionally. We have built into the day periods of time for reflection.
I mean, I usually do not talk about the Holocaust, but...
You grew up in Nazi Germany?
Yeah, I grew up in Nazi Germany, but I also think at some point it has to end. The talking about it from people like me, and...
I've never heard you talk about it.
I never talk about it.
How old were you when you left?
15. It wasn't so bad when I left. I mean, it wasn't pleasant, but it was no Holocaust yet.
When was that?
38. Are we on now?
All of your family left at the same time, or?
Well, let's just stop. Can we stop for a minute? I believe it was 13 members of my family that were killed, so that is obviously something. And many of the people I went to school with, I would say about 40% of those I went to school with, plus my grandmother.
For about 3 years, this relentless traffic of death continued. As late as the summer of 1944, trains from Hungary and the large ghetto in Poland brought hundreds of thousands of Jews to be murdered at Auschwitz.
The aim of this part of the course, the actual visit to Auschwitz, is to add another dimension to your understanding of the Holocaust. Actually being there, experiencing what it is like today, is a memorable experience, one I'm sure will stick with you for the rest of your lives.
It takes time to create a story, a narrative, out of a historical event. Our understanding, not only of the event as a super event, but of the protagonists in that event, has changed enormously over time. Even in terms of the early perceptions of what we call now Holocaust, the Holocaust was taken out of the war. It was an event that almost, I would say, happened in a vacuum. It was not related to history.
These are Nazi concentration camps. In hundreds like them since 1933, the Nazis have imprisoned their enemies. Now these camps are being overrun by the armies of the Allies. 12 years, the Nazis developed and perfected deliberate, scientific, cold-blooded methods. Methods for smashing and destroying all those who fought against them. Germans who refused to conform, and the hundreds of thousands of Europeans who refused to accept, were taught the Nazi lessons. Among these 35,000 were Poles, Germans, and Russians.
During the war, indeed after the war, and for a lot of years after the war, it wasn't that people didn't know the Nazi regime had murdered millions of Jews in Europe. They did in a general kind of way. But the heaps of bodies in the newsreel photographs at that time, the skeletal figures of the survivors in 1945, these were victims of Nazism defined in a kind of ecumenical fashion. The Holocaust was not an it, was not a thing. It was simply a dimension of Nazi murderousness and brutality in general. It was sort of the Jewish subdivision of the crimes of Nazism, not a distinct thing the way we talk about it today.
There are the bodies, and all those guys are dead.
I can't say have an enjoyable day, have a memorable day. I hope you get something worthwhile out of today, and I'm sure you will.
The camp in Auschwitz became the largest extermination center. Jews who were living in all European countries controlled by the Nazi Germany were sort of sentenced to death.
Yeah, it's just
Everything is political. At least for me, everything is political. In the case of the Holocaust, it has been politicized, even I think before people realized there was a Holocaust, or we named it as a Holocaust.
General Eisenhower conducts a personal investigation. Any person guilty of maltreating or allowing to be maltreated, any Allied prisoner of war, internee or deportee, will be ruthlessly pursued and brought to punishment.
It's not like the story we know today that the Americans liberated the Jews and liberated the camps. Auschwitz was liberated by the Soviets, not by the British and not by the Americans. Without the Soviets, that war would have never been won. But it was disallowed to even mention the Soviet contribution. And disremembering became part of the political agenda. The alignments changed immediately after the war. You had to carry on with the Germans as the West's allies.